right. Well, welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brandon Amalani. I'll be your host for today's interview. I got a really special guest who is in my opinion, sort of a renaissance man. He's somebody who's an inventor. He's dabbles heavily or works heavily in electronics, herbalism, alchemy, has this kind of extensive background, which I think is really unique to the practical applications of any kind of technology, blending natural principles, natural laws, and working in harmony with nature with all technology is super important. So I wanted to introduce you to Paul Harris. Most of you might know him through his work and invention, the Theraphi, which he's the inventor and produces that up in Canada. So I'm really excited to have you here. It's been a long time coming. We've been trying to get this interview going for a while, and we get to finally sit down. So thanks for making time with your busy schedule.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brandon. Yeah, it has been quite a while, but yeah, it's good to finally get down to it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I wanted to kind of start for people that don't really know of you or heard of Theraphi or any of your inventions. Can you give us kind of like a background on like who you are, where you came from, and what you do?
Yeah, sure. I grew up, you know, sort of one of those strange kids. I didn't play much football or sports or anything like that. I spent most of my time in the library reading books and things like that. And when I was growing up, I just took everything apart. Every time my parents had an old toaster or something like that that didn't work anymore, I got it. And eventually my bedroom accumulated all these electronic things and stuff like that over the years, and picked away, and mostly self-taught. Studied a lot of esoteric philosophy over the years. That's kind of what got me into alchemy. When I even read, certain occult type books and stuff like that, they briefly mentioned alchemy, but never really got into it. So I guess I got into that kind of stuff at a young age, starting in the library with books on UFOs and Bigfoot and stuff like that, and just went deeper down the rabbit holes over the years. So,
So
yeah.
wow, that's so you started early on. What age are we talking about getting into interested in electronics? Because I don't think that's really kind of a typical thing for children to be taking apart
No.
toasters at a young age.
Right. Yeah. Well, it started with the broken things, and then I think I was always into music. My dad had a reel to reel, and he recorded all kinds of stuff over the years when he was growing up. So we lived in a house of music and listened to a lot of, rock and roll and stuff like that. The Beatles and Pink Floyd and all this old type music. And so I had a keen interest in that, and so I had my own sound system and stuff. So every time my dad would get a new stereo, I'd get the old one. And then when it came time to get a new TV, we had a color TV, and the old black and white one, I got that one. So I got to completely disassemble that and figure out how it worked. And yeah, then when my parents went out one day and came back, then I had the new color TV all apart, and they were like, "What's going on?" I was like, don't worry, I'll put it back together." Of course, everything was all tubes and high voltage and everything back then. So it was a great learning experience, just dabbling in those sort of realms of electronics. And yeah, I
Yeah,
was
that's
also interested in chemistry. That was the other thing, I guess, that really got me going on electronics was I always wanted a chemistry set. So every year, my birthday or Christmas or whatever, and I'm like a chemistry set every year. And my parents always said, "No, we're not getting you a chemistry set because you'll blow yourself up." So one year, they got me an electronics kit, and it was one of these Radio Shack 1,000 or 101 projects that you could build on this board that just had all these components on it. And that's really was my education in electronics, starting with the Radio Shack books and electronics, going down to Radio Shack and picking up parts, and and I made radios and all the little circuits you could do there, blinking lights and things like that.
that's
Yeah.
incredible, and that actually kind of answers one of my questions I have on my list, which is how long have you been, uh, you know, working with electronics and all of this kind of stuff? It sounds like from a very young age, but when did you actually make the connection with, electronics and electrotherapy for like health and wellness or consciousness expansion or any of these kind of
Right. Right.
concepts?
Yeah, I would say that shortly after I got out of high school, there was a book that came out, Barry Loyne's The Cancer Cure That Worked. And it was in one of the esoteric bookshops that I always shopped at. So I picked it up off the shelf and bought it and read through it, and it told the story of Royal Raymond Rife. And I was just blown away that nobody had heard of this guy. Like, I spent many years looking at, different people over the years that were fairly, not well known, or created achieved great things and never really got acknowledgement for them, like Nikola Tesla, like Victor Schauberger. These were the kind of people that I was into, finding out who these people were, Wilhelm Reich, and reading their stories and their works and things like that. So when I come across Rife, I was like, I'd never heard of this guy. Who is this guy? And that's when I took a deep dive into what Rife was doing. And there wasn't much around at that time, but we had a group in Canada, uh, and we would meet every year and do a Rife conference. And basically everybody would get together, and slowly during that time, I guess in the 90s, early 2000s, more and more stuff of Rife's was, appearing on the scene. Like, all of a sudden somebody found an attic full of reel-to-reel tapes of Rife's talking through his experiments, and that hours and hours and hours of it. And we started sharing all these things, and we collected photos and from the universal microscope that Rife had taken, because of course he was good friends with Carl Zeiss, who made the lenses for the microscope, and the story just slowly evolved. So I was really kind of privileged to be a part of that. And then James Bear was one of the main ones who was putting on the conference, and he came up with a device using basically a ham radio amplifier and a CB radio. And I had all this stuff on the shelf. So when I got into it, I was like, okay, well, this is where what I'm going to do is start building these things. So I would take out the harmonic suppression circuits in the CB radios and basically drive signals straight into this 300-watt ham radio amplifier that really you could talk to somebody on the other side of the world with this much power. But
Right.
the principle was that you were taking all this RF power and dumping it into a plasma tube, basically. So it's just a long cylinder of evacuated gas. And the fellow back then who made a lot of those was up in Edmonton. We did the conference up in Edmonton. It started at Don Tunney's out in Comox, and moved to Edmonton for quite a few years. And then I met a glass blower. We were working on a water project, and we did a lot of water experiments. And yeah, basically before there was bottled water, we started a bottled water company, and we were making this water. It was called Sacred Water. And we were using all kinds of electrical and frequency based devices to influence the water. And people back then, this was before the days of bottled water, people were like, you're crazy, no one's going to buy water in a bottle. No one's going to pay for water. So it was kind of one of those projects that was a little bit ahead of its time. Did some amazing things with water, created water that glue in the dark, water that can contain all kinds of information and be retrieved from it, um, structuring water in all kinds of different ways, different types of ice. It really got really interesting. And but nobody got it back then, I guess. Is like, I suppose with a lot of the things I've created over the years, they've been sort of ahead of their time. That's one of my downfalls, is being too far ahead of the curve.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say that, and I'm really excited to dig deeper into some of the things and projects and technologies that you were ahead of the time on. I'm curious though, to give people context. What era was that when you were starting to first build your first Rife machines and working with plasma and doing all of this stuff? Was this like the 90s or?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, 1990 or so. And from, yeah, early 90s to, well, the funny thing about all that, I was building those machines, and there was people that got it, right? And they were like, oh, I had quite a few friends who were naturopaths and owned vitamin stores and health clinics and stuff like that. And they were quick to adopt them, and they understood it. But the majority of people were just like, no, this is just pseudoscience. The body has nothing to do with electricity or frequencies. And, there was a heavy resistance back then. And Yeah, eventually I made those machines for several years and sold them, and was punching 300 watts into really big tubes. Because I met this glass blower with the water company. I said, "Hey, can you blow me these tubes?" So started
Yep.
blowing gas tubes with every kind of noble gas you and other gases you can imagine, and created some really unique combinations of gases in the tubes, because that was a big thing back then. It was everybody had their proprietary kind of blend of what they thought was
Right.
an effective gas combination in tubes.
All right.
Yeah,
So
you had
let
tubes.
me stop you there. Like
Yeah,
plasma in particular.
right.
So what got you into wanting to work with plasma? Because like with Theraphi, for example, it's this multiple modality, like all these kind of modalities wrapped into one system, but your primary um, delivery system is through plasma. So can you tell us a little bit about like what got you attracted to plasma? Obviously, the early Rife machines and everything were using a plasma. Can you tell us a little bit about plasma and why you're attracted to
Right.
using that versus lasers versus other types of light and photobiomodulations?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, one of my heroes, of course, was Nikola Tesla back then, and I built a fair number of Tesla coils that, of course, create this arc off the top of the coil, and that's essentially plasma. And I was became fascinated with it. We used a lot of plasma type things in working with the water as well, like ozone. I mean, we're generating ozone with plasma and running different gases through the so you're running oxygen, and then you're chaining oxygens together into not only O3, O4, O5, O6. They form these long chains, and it's this extreme free radical that when it breaks apart, it does oxidative things, which is it can be used for good purposes. Of course, we know that oxidization and everything in the body is not good, but you can use it to kill pathogens. So you can make really sterile, clean water. So the more I played with plasma, the more fascinated I got. And yeah, how it responded. One of my biggest things was just creating plasma tubes and just turning them on and sitting in front of them and watching, observing, right? And plasma behaves in a lot of really interesting ways. Like you can take a magnet and put it towards the plasma and it'll move away from the field. And it's almost like it's conscious. And that's actually what how they thought about it in the early days, like Irving Langmuir, who actually coined the term plasma for photonic emission from gases. He named it plasma because he said it's like blood plasma. It kind of behaves in the same way, and he said there's something to it. And a lot of people that understood it and were looking at it in the early days like that had this idea that had some kind of sense of consciousness like that, how it knew to repel from a magnetic field, and the structure of it, how it could form to a shape, whatever it would be confined to. It kind of fills the space in a certain way. And then my biggest interest in just understanding nature led me to realize that the Earth is just a giant uh, Theraphi, if you will. It has these two poles, and the aurora borealis and the southern lights. The has the electro ionosphere. Receives energies from the sun. These incredible amounts of energy come into the Earth and particles, and light up the sky with plasma. So the more I got into it, the more I related it to nature. And when you really think about it, well, the universe is 99.9% plasma. It just makes all the sense in the world that by going down that rabbit hole, you're getting to the essence of what is this? Where what is this space and this time that we're in? And that's always been my biggest question: is why am I here and what's this all about, right?
Yeah.
Which any good scientist, that's the thing. You want to understand nature and then categorize and classify.
Mm.
It's gone extreme with scientism these days, but the early scientists were all alchemists and astrologers and philosophers, and that was kind of the route that I took. I guess it's what you'd call a polymath or something like that, who just
Right.
had an understanding of many things. And that's what's important in order to understand it. and part of the problem with the reason why we have this, scientism today is because everybody's kind of put in their little box, and you go through a university education
Right.
and you specify and specialize in one thing, and then you don't know what's happening in the department next door.
Right.
Uh, and until you can understand all those different vectors of science, really, biology, chemistry, physics, electronics, you can't put the pieces together. So for me, that was always a big thing. And it
Right.
was a long, slow learning process, but it's what I felt was necessary. I used to say, most people build a city and then they have one tower in the middle of the city that is their big masterpiece in their life's work or whatever it is. I'm a poet or an artist or whatever. But I said, I'm building a city of high rises, very slowly, and all these buildings are going
Yeah. And that's what you
down.
notice with like dogmatic scientism, or what they call scientism these days, is that, yeah, there's a bought and paid for aspect, but there's also, yeah, they're too much in their echo chamber, and then they get too attached to ideas. And when things change, that's why you see, I think, a lot of moving goalposts, with
Right.
science. Like, so you got theory of relativity, but that doesn't quite work with quantum mechanics. And then quantum mechanics doesn't quite work with holographic theory. So there's all these kind of ideas and theories that we try and build, the skyscraper on. And when you invest that much in a skyscraper, it's expensive to tear it down and rebuild it. And
Yeah.
so I think you touched on a lot of things there. So like living in a plasma field. So we're surrounded by plasma energy and bioactive plasma fields. They feed our cells. It's, part of like how the sun and the moon, and, I've heard analogies with like an anode to cathode, and how like the electrical nature of the planet is in, helping biology to thrive and create new life. So this is a little off topic of what we were going to talk about with the Theraphi, but I'm curious your opinion on this, because when we talk about laying in a bioactive plasma field like with Theraphi, you talk about not having metal on your body. And now we're
Mhm.
kind of in a day and age where people are plugging themselves into grounding outlets. They have like canopies, or wearing, silver lined underwear and stuff like this to protect against EMF.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious what your take is on how that affects our biofield, bioelectricity, how that affects our interface with these biological or natural plasma fields in nature, and kind of what your take is on all of that.
Yeah. That's good because yeah, it's actually one of my pet peeves is what's happened with that grounding movement. Like, absolutely, grounding is great. I mean, it all started with, just going out bare feet on the grass, and people doing qigong and tai chi and things like that, connecting with the earth and having that deep grounding sense. But there's some misunderstandings out there about grounding. I think is a big thing to touch on. That I've said for many years, there's been a lot of misunderstandings, again, where this empirical science idea just says, oh yeah, this is what it's about, and then people all go down that railroad train and then realize that the foundation was weak. So just to clarify on that, I think, one of the issues that people are doing with the grounding, and they'll plug it into their plug socket in the wall of their house and use the ground plug on it. Many of those grounding blankets come with just an adapter that screws onto the ground plug and goes into your ground.
Mm-hmm.
When you're doing that, you're actually tying yourself into the grid, because your house is part of the electrical grid, and the ground, that when power comes into your house, it's grounded. So the neutral line in your house is grounded. And when we plug all these things into our local house circuit, if you will, those ground loops get formed, and that is actually really noisy on that ground line, and it's connecting you in with that grid. So you're more or less plugging yourselves into the grid. And when you take a meter and show that, oh yeah, you're going to ground, it's only to your local ground. But the proper way to do grounding, if I've got nothing against the grounding mats and all those things, is just don't plug them into your house, plug them into a real ground. Take a wire, connect it to your inside of your room, and put it out your window, and find the spot and location. Hopefully you sleep on the opposite side of the house where your electrical panel is.
Mm-hmm.
Put a ground rod in over there, and then have a true ground that's not part of your electrical system to use the grounding. And then they're quite effective. You'll notice your dreams change, everything changes.
So is there any aspects when you talk about connecting the grid? Obviously, what you're saying is like it's a noise to signal ratio. So you're just basically creating a lot of chaos at the cellular level, I would assume, and how the water's structured in the body and everything. Is there any risk of like stray voltage, because things that aren't properly grounded, or, obviously if you live in a city, it's a little bit more challenging than if you have some acreage or live in nature and can go right into the ground, or a
Yeah.
setup like you're saying. Is there any kind of risks of that as far as,
Yeah, well, when you do that, you become part of the antenna, like the grounding plane of the antenna. So if you think about it, the more EMF you're going to have in your space, when you ground yourself, you're really just kind of making yourself more that being able to absorb into you and then and go to ground too. So
wow.
yeah,
So what you're saying is like basically like if you have a canopy, it's something that's not, let's say we're not talking about grounded, but just metal in the environment, and why you don't want metal
right,
when you're laying on a Theraphi. Just
yeah.
metal in the environment would have kind of a act like an aerial, especially if the surface area is quite high, I would
Yeah.
assume, correct?
Yeah, it's all about surface area, and especially when it comes down to Theraphi, what's happening around the Theraphi is it's purposely creating an electrostatic field all around in the environment, and you're immersed in that field. So you don't, when you put metal into that field, it'll distort the field. Very much so, like I was saying, when you put a magnet towards the plasma in the tube, it'll repel from the tube. When you put a piece of large metal in the field, that metal becomes part of the field because it's highly conductive. So it absorbs the
Right.
dielectric portion of the, which is the healthier, beneficial side of the electrical fields we're creating, and it concentrates it, and it becomes what I call it changes it from a constructive, cold electricity type force that has energetic qualities, to a destructive force, and concentrates that energy into this mass. And depending on the surface area, that charge can build up, and then it becomes hot electricity. And these terms, cold and hot electricity, are kind of the way Tesla described electricity, and a few people that understood these dielectric principles of electricity over the years. So we're trying to avoid that destructive principle. In the when I was building the Rife machines, I compare the Rife type units as a destructive forces that you're creating with the plasma, and those are meant to destroy viruses and bacteria. Essentially, that's what Rife was doing, them hitting the resonant frequencies of things and shattering them like an opera singer with a wine glass. But the Theraphi is based on constructive frequencies and principles that we're trying to accumulate the beneficial aspects of that electrical field, not to destroy, but to empower and give your body the energy it needs and create the field around it to increase the conductivity. And that's a big thing that plasma does. Basically, what plasma does is there's a high resistance when you have gas in a tube and you have your anode and a cathode. Before that lights up, there's quite a high resistance. So you have
Yeah.
a really cheap resistance. And the first thing that happens is a dark plasma forms. And that's the alignment of the molecules inside the tube. And this is really important because this led me into a further understanding of consciousness and memory and how the brain works. And this is the way I've kind of always thought about it, as a dark plasma field that's around your body. Like we've all seen the pictures of the auras and everything around your
Hmm.
body. That is kind of like a dark plasma. So what happens, it has a lot of resistance at first, and then when it breaks down and it actually lines up the molecules enough to conduct the current through it, that resistance drops really low, and all of a sudden it's a conductor. So it goes from a full resistor to being a really good conductor. And as those molecules inside the tube line up, they provide a pathway for that current to go through. And as the electrons get excited and jump off of the atoms, they give off these photons, and that photonic emission is what you see in the lit plasma. Then you have a cold plasma at this point, and that temperature can get up to 100 120 degrees or so, kind of considered cold. But then the more energy you pump into it, it gets hotter and then turns into hot plasmas. Then we get things like stars and suns and
Hmm.
welders and all the things we do with high energy plasmas.
Right. So that's a good distinction that you don't really hear a lot of places, the destructive and constructive. People just tend to focus on frequencies. They tend to focus on specific type of wavelength transmissions and stuff, but they don't really discern the difference between constructive and destructive interference on the body. So what you were saying back to the metal in the field, so it's distorting the actual field, not necessarily like the dielectric of the body, because your body's like absorbing the plasma, and really it's kind of like a battery charger, so to speak.
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to ask you also about the Theraphi in general, because there's a lot of machines that have come out in the last 10, 15 years that charge up the body from everything from PEMF to plasma systems. You'll see those long, tall standing machines that, they'll either pulse or they'll be on for a period of time. And a lot of them have gone from analog to digital. So they have some kind of algorithm that they're running to pitch modulate the plasma. How is this particular design that you came up with, what makes it so effective? Because clearly everybody that I've put on it, has really great results. They get into like a theta brainwave state, just this kind of like dreamlike state. They're super relaxed, they're super calm. They can feel this subtle kind of buzzing is usually the term that's used most often.
Right.
What's really the distinction here, and why the two plasma fields, um, you know, pointed at each other? Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I guess I was thinking about this the other day, and I guess I was probably the first to combine a lot of these things into one device. Like there was, PMFs, and because I spent years from starting with Rife machines building, pulse magnetic field magnets and all kinds of things like that. And the idea with the Theraphi was to roll all those kind of modalities into one device. And also, what's very unique is the way it creates an electroacoustic wave that's surrounding the body in this electrostatic field. What everybody was doing up until 10 years ago, I guess, when the Theraphi came out, uh, was just driving frequencies into it. So the whole idea behind what Rife was doing, there was an empirical list of frequencies, and everybody had just kind of discovered certain frequencies that worked for certain things. And there's even a big database of, it's available as part of the Spooky 2 program platform. Those were lists that we called Rife lists back in the days, and we would
Mm-hmm.
just accumulate frequencies. And Rife only really ever used about 6 to 7 frequencies. He didn't have too many, but over the years, everybody kind of said, "Oh, I had a sprained wrist, and I put my hand in the field at this frequency, and it felt a lot better." So we were like, "Okay, pain." So slowly, all these frequencies got categorized, and up until the beginning of Theraphi, nobody was modulating, more complex waveforms into devices like that. They were just pulsing straight frequencies. So you had 10 kilohertz going in, and it was pulsing that, and they would put a carrier wave on it, or a pump wave kind of thing, not a carrier wave, sorry, like a pump wave that would break it up and then make those 10 kilohertz break up into larger square waves. And those have a lot of force and a lot of power, and they have this destructive power that I talk about, where
Mm-hmm.
targeting viruses and bacteria and that. So I wanted to get away from that and say, well, yeah, we can make these destructive side of things, but how do we make it constructive? And yeah, the idea of the two tubes came about because my initial concept was, I don't know if you're familiar with the Teslatron and Guy Belinsky in upstate New York there, and he had that big device, and it was like a room that
Yeah.
you could go. So my dream was, how do we get somebody inside of the plasma field? Because that's what he was ultimately doing there, and it was really cool. I thought, well, we want to get him inside the tube itself, So I thought maybe making like a giant tube that was like an MRI machine that you could go into the inside of the tube and you were completely surrounded
Right.
by plasma.
And
This would have several effects, kind of like a Cozy Rev. The Cozy Rev mirror kind of had effects like that, where you just stand in a reflective surface. If you ever put a stainless steel or a really shiny bowl next to your face and you feel that radiant energy coming backwards from
yeah.
it, that was the idea. I thought, your body would feed out and then reabsorb that energy back into it. But just wasn't practical to make a big tube like that.
Yeah, on a lot of levels, cost probably mostly,
Yeah.
and getting it to people. But that's
Yeah.
really interesting because the the Theraphi, you were able to create a field as if you were in, in like that MRI type setup, because it's really just about the electrostatic field. And when you're talking about utilizing frequencies, um, when you're talking about constructive frequencies, is it absolutely, one of my questions I had was like, do you actually need frequency or not? Because it sounds like from what you were saying that a lot of the frequencies that were like, I had my wrist and it felt better. A lot of that database, which is massive at this point, that you can find from different companies, have aggregated it. It seems like just random numbers, and like, they'll have like a 10,000 hertz, for example, for a lot of different things. Is it mostly anecdotal that these have been come across? I know Rife was actually using microscopes. He was actually watching cells in real time being affected by radio frequency. Do you feel like a lot of that database has been, just more subjective and user experience related?
Yeah, yeah, 100%. It's kind of anecdotal, just experience over the years. And it seemed to work. I've used a lot of them over the years, and they seem to be pretty specific to a lot of things. The important thing is that frequencies, people say, well, there's good frequencies and there's bad frequencies. But the universe itself is just all frequencies. When you look at background noise, if you have a spectrum analyzer and you turn it on and you say, all right, what's out there? All the way from cosmic radiation down to ELFs, all the way down
Mm-hmm.
to planetary movements of really slow, low cycles. That the wavelengths of these things can be from billions of miles long, or light years, even all the way up to very high frequencies. Now we're into, the gigahertz and the terahertz range. As our technology progresses, we can achieve, higher and higher frequency resonances. But when you go back and you look at what you're getting when you're standing on the ground in your bare feet on the dewy grass, is you're getting the whole background of frequencies. Every frequency exists. When you look at your spectrum analyzer, it's like a wall of noise, and this is what we call noise. So white noise, where every frequency is going all at the same time, but none of them really stand out. It's a pretty even wave form from spectrum from low to high frequencies.
Mm-hmm.
And when you create one of these frequency devices, or you have something like a power station that's generating at 60 hertz or whatever, you get a spike in that, in all those, uh, different frequencies that are going. So there's always multiple frequencies, and everything's not one frequency. Another pet
Right.
peeve of mine is that people say, "Oh yeah, the liver, it's 268 hertz or whatever." Like when they nail something down and say it like that, it just doesn't work that way. There are so many different frequencies operating at the same time.
Right.
And it might be that when you increase that particular frequency, it does have some kind of resonance effect to it, but it's not just the one frequency. There's also in those devices, the reason why we were taking out the harmonic suppression in the early days of the Rifes is because you wanted to do that. In a CB radio, if you're talking to somebody, on another trucker down the road, you want to have a very clean, strong signal like that, and you don't want the other harmonics coming up, because that'll make
Right.
other wavelengths of frequencies going out. So they put this circuits in there to make sure that that one peak is really strong. It doesn't make the harmonics. But what I found over the years was that the more harmonics you had inclusive in the signal, then the better it worked. So you were using multiple wavelengths that were corresponding in harmonics with the main peak, and then so that may be a case for how that one frequency is sort of like a guideline for that particular organ that you're working at, but there's many other frequencies at play. I think
Right.
it's important to understand that, because there are no good and no bad frequencies. They're just how you apply them.
How they're created and transmitted, and then also the complexity of it, because you could look at a carrier signal, which is a certain frequency, but then you can have upper and lower sideband modulation within that and not really get the notes of those, which could be, I guess, correlated to harmonics or other different
Yeah.
layerments of how a signal is being perceived or transmitted or what have you. um, that's and that's cool stuff. So um, I want to get in a little bit into the weeds, because um, talks that I've heard you do in the past before, in conversations that we've had, I've heard you reference like, electrons and particles, but then you've also mentioned ether, which,
Yeah,
with the Michelson-Morley experiment, and, that's basically like that pinnacle where people stop saying like, oh, maybe the ether doesn't exist.
right.
There's all these disagreements. And again, we get into that idea of like, science is never really settled. If you're intellectually honest, we're always questioning what we think we know and how do we get more comprehensive understanding, which is what I really appreciate about you and your multi-dimensional and kind of multifaceted approach to health, wellness, life, energy products. Everything you do is kind of has this universal, you know, theme going through it, which is consciousness, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious when we talk about, because I've heard you say before that there's spin and opposing spin, and we're kind of getting into these longitudinal compressions and refractions with Theraphi. What is spin? What's going on with ether? What's going on with particle physics? Let's just break it
Right.
down.
Yeah. Well, it comes down to it's all about spin and angular momentum. When you're looking at it from a particle's perspective, you have to look at it from both sides. Like, is it a particle? Is it a wave? Well, it's both. And the reason why it is because it's much more complex than that. They're not just marbles that are rolling around, bumping off of each other. Those are highly concentrated, dense. I like to look at it as solidified light. And all the elements on the periodic table basically get denser and denser. Start with hydrogen, which is the most abundant element in the universe. Well, how does hydrogen come into existence if everything, and then how does everything come into existence thereafter? And then this was kind of like an alchemical perspective that I had from more esoteric philosophies, and how the alchemists really thought about things, because they thought or realized that everything is conscious to some level, degree, or another. And especially when you're working with plants and animals and things like that, you understand it. Yeah, I used to laugh when people say, are animals conscious or whatever? I was like, what, are you crazy? Of course they are. They're aware of themselves. They dream. If anyone's had a dog and watched my dog dreaming in his sleep, and you see his feet going, he's running
Yeah.
around and he's doing all the dog things, right? Um, so when you look at it on that level, you have to say, okay, what is all this matter and how did it all come about? And the only thing that really provides the matrix or the canvas for this matter to exist is the ether. It just makes all the sense in the world. I picture it like a net, or like Indra's net is a good Indian philosophy of how this works. And there's this giant three-dimensional net. Got to stop thinking of things in 2D and go into, or in XYZ axis to get it. But every node where all those threads of the net come together is a sphere, and that sphere reflects every other sphere in every other node. So it creates this holographic infinite in either direction, just like frequencies. The
Yep.
farther, or particles, the farther, we can create CERN and we start smashing particles, the farther we go down, the more we find. And that's because as you collide these particles together, they break apart into other smaller pieces, and it'll just go on infinitely in either direction. I like to say. I don't know. They're looking for the God particle, or the limit, where it's going to go. But I think the
Right.
more we progress, the more we'll realize we're in such an infinite universe, omniverse, that just goes beyond anything we could ever imagine. We're in this little sliver. We're in this little, you're looking at your spectrum analyzer and that little spike. We're in that little narrow bandwidth. We only see, hear, smell, taste in such a limited wavelength, that's our limitations. So until we were able to create scientific instruments and spectrum analyzers and things that could look outside of what we can see, hear, feel, smell, touch,
Right.
then we realize there's more to it. And the further we go, it seems like there's more and more there is to it. So
Yeah. It doesn't.
that's how
Go
I
ahead.
like to look at it. It's both, because what happens in the ether is these wavelengths converge. So think of dropping two rocks into a swimming pool at the same time.
Mhm.
Those waves ripple out and they intermesh, and they don't interfere with these non-interference. The rings will move and they'll keep moving. They didn't collide and bump it out. but then they hit a solid
Right.
wall on the other side of the pyramid or the pool, right? And what did they do? They reflected, they bounced off that wall and came back again. And then even those waves didn't converge. So there's something about the patterns, and that's how you have to look at it in ether. The way I like to think about it is when those harmonic nodes of interference patterns get strong enough, they take that, energy or whatever it is that comes into a dense particle that forms a nuclei. So you have your first proton of your first hydrogen, and then matter evolves onwards from there.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, and I agree with everything you're saying because I mean the holographic, because when you think about a hologram, it's a projection. So and everything being light, obviously there's refractions of that, and how it moves and the patterns that all definitely makes sense. So would you say that the because obviously if you can ask a physicist, define field, defined energy, or electrons are just, would you say they're more metaphorical because they haven't really ever been isolated as far as like you can't just say here is an electron, for
Right.
example.
Yeah.
And obviously the ether has its own like non-Cartesian value where you can't like quantify it and measure it in a box because it's outside of the box, right?
Right.
So um, it's like on both spectrums, it's seemingly like polarized with the conversation, but what you're doing and the way you're explaining it is kind of cool because it's like harmonizing those two ideas as they work in like tandem, because there has to be what like Ken Wheeler calls the hysteresis of the ether. There's a response, like what is this field, in the spherical harmonics that you're referencing, and the curvilinear nature of how the, everything kind of moves in these shapes and patterns is really kind of fascinating. So related to Theraphi, the spin, how are you, so you're able to spin the energy or the electrostatic field in one direction on one side and then a
Yeah.
completely different, what happens at the
Yeah.
convergence of these two opposing fields
Right.
spinning in different directions?
Yeah. Yeah. So that all came from the idea of, looking at the Earth itself. And we have a North Pole and a South Pole, and the Earth is spinning. Of course, everything in the universe is spinning. And so what happens when those two opposite spins converge? And this is what the Russians referred to as torsion fields, and this idea. A lot of people confuse all these things, but they're very distinct in understanding these principles. And anything with the spin and that, these torsion fields, they can torque together or torque apart to create things. It's the living, breathing, system of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
The whole idea is the universe expanding or contracting? Are we growing or are we evolving? But it's both. It's a living, breathing system where stars are born and they explode and spin out into galaxies and create bigger fields, and then at times it recondenses when it hits the end and goes back into it, collapses, and it's like a breathing system. So I think that's how I look at it. And when you have these two opposite spinning fields, you're twisting anything time you can create a twist, because I guess you got to go back to look at it astronomically as well. In between every star and every, and then our sun, when you look up, you see a point of light. And those points of
Mm-hmm.
light are all connected to all the other points of light. There's
Right.
some really good 3D modeling renders of the universe where they zoom way back and it looks like mycelium of mushrooms moving through. They're all networks, right? And you look at a blow up of our Ethernet here on Earth and all our computer networks, it's identical. You look at mycelium, it's identical. You look at
The
cobwebs,
brain.
all that
Yeah.
kind of thing. So these light tubes interconnect. So every star is interconnected to the other star through these light tube threads that, interestingly enough, are the plasma that forms the electromagnetic fields around them, because they're moving and currents are moving through it. So they create, a magnetic field around it, and they twist just like DNA. And they always seem to trend to form into these dual threads that have a spiral that goes in between. So these light threads are connecting all these things. So creating that spin encourages that type of motion in that type of connection. And I think of plasma, especially in the Theraphi, the plasma, the way it's generated, are really fractal antennas that, because the plasma can go all the way down to a single atom of noble gas that's in there. You've got huge potential for multiple frequencies, all the way down to an atomic level, very high vibration, high frequency, all the way out to as big as your tube can be, basically, or your network or your circuit, to go to lower frequencies.
Hmm.
So this is, again, how to increase this really broad spectrum. And when you take two opposing fields and put them together, and this is where the whole idea of the phase conjugation
Hmm.
and really, one of the key things behind the Theraphi, I think, is the actual cancellation of the phases, where the two have a +1 and or a +10, let's say, and a -10. They're meeting, and where do they meet? At that middle, that 0 point, like you mentioned Ken earlier, what he would call that dielectric field of inertia in magnetism,
Hmm.
or counter space is a really good way to look at it. And so when those spinning fields in opposite directions, because they're both polarity charged and spin charged in opposite directions, and the key behind Theraphi is to make all those modalities converge and cancel each other out into that counter space, that 0 point, and that's where the magic happens.
So,
That's when you get this idea of scalar. This is what scalar fields really are. It's not proper to say waves, so it's good to differentiate between waves and fields as
mhm.
well. A lot of these are field effects. They're created with waves that are, like the idea about this longitudinal wave is to get this longitudinal setup happening, which also happens really easily in the Theraphi. And this is how it becomes this electroacoustic field that's around you. Those compression and rarefaction of the longitudinal aspect of it too also converge and cancel each other out.
So when you
That's where
say
the magic happens.
electroacoustic, is that so you're talking about infrasound? Because like acoustic meaning sound, people will think like where are the acoustics? This thing's completely silent, which is cool for an energy device. A lot of them are like loud. When you look at PEMF or you look at any of these photon, like the
Yeah,
plasma machines, they're just like just making all these sounds. A lot of them are like these different types of circuits, but this is like super quiet. So where's the acoustic part of it come into play? And also, can you
great.
define phase conjugation? Like, I think for people
Yeah,
who have never heard of this stuff, we want to kind of like, what is
right.
phase conjugation actually? Because that term gets thrown around, and I think a lot of people use it out of context or downright incorrectly. So, I was hoping you
100.
can like go into that a little bit.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. I mean, the way to look at phases, when you go back to electrical generation, when you have a magnetic field that's moving, or a conductor moving through a magnetic field, one or the other. So we build these generators at the power station, and as that rotation of the field goes, it creates like a clock, and this is what we call phase. So this phase relationship, how that spinning, again, it's a sort of a spin calculation that you have to take into all this, right? And so when you have different phases on different faces of that clock, let's say you're transmitting, and this gets done, I think the easiest way to think about it is how it works in a cellular phone network, where they have antennas, and they'll have an antenna array when you see some of these towers. And I know you talk a lot about this. So here's how they're working. When they're actually utilizing technology that will pinpoint your phone, let's say. So if the majority of the phones are here or whatever, they know they need to concentrate their signal over there. They'll use a phase conjugation where they have an antenna array, and each one of them is slightly out of phase to the other. But that phase adjustment allows those antennas, instead of all just transmitting out like this, to converge and conjugate the phases to concentrate, so that you have a stronger signal right where you're at here. And phase conjugation is, taking those phases and integrating them in together to make more impact at a particular space.
That's a
So
really good explanation.
Yeah, that's probably the easiest way.
Yeah. So with phase conjugation, with how you're doing it to create, so are you essentially taking these frequencies in the plasma field and demodulating them and collapsing them into this 0 point or scalar field? What happens? So why would somebody want to like lay in a 0 point field? Like there's no frequency, there's no at that point no modulation. It's collapsed and neutralized field. Some people might think, oh, it's a neutralized field. There's no energy there anymore because
Yeah,
it's fully.
right.
Just because something is nothing doesn't mean it's no thing. So can you go into a little bit about that that center point, that 0 point field, and how that
Right.
you know um, works in regards to biology?
Well, it kind of comes into the second law of thermodynamics and everything. And, everybody's looking for this free energy source and all these kind of things. And to get this energy, how do we create energy, from nothing? But nobody ever looks at it the other way is like we create all this energy and it all disappears. Where does it go? So if it can't be created or destroyed, where is it going and where is it coming from? And this has to do,
Wormholes.
yeah, exactly. So this is how you have to understand it. So if you're at a plus 10, you have a huge potential to a minus 10, and then you cancel those out at that 0 point. Where does that go? And that's how I like to see. This is the best way to kind of understand a scalar field is that it goes somewhere and then it enfolds into itself into the ether, and that's why that field can do many magical things. Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, so that's kind of the essentially the way I look at it.
Yeah, and talking about the two viewpoints that nobody can seem to agree on is that like yeah, it decays in the ether is one way to look at it, or the move it's like always it's almost omnipresent within the subatomic space. If we want to talk about subatomic
Yeah.
particles, it would be kind of like the superluminal or faster than the speed of light there. So the potentiality, I guess, would be from what you're saying would be the benefit of laying in a field that creates this collapsed or 0 point field because you literally have an infinitesimally I don't know if you could say small, but an infinite potential field. So the body can
Infinite
almost take
potential.
what it uses. So are the
That's it.
frequencies even relevant at that point? So you have
Yeah.
this really
Yeah.
cool algorithm that you're breaking down. You're creating the phase conjugation. You're creating the collapsed field. And then, there's really no frequency at that point.
Right.
Is the frequency just a mechanism to get to the collapsed wave or
Yeah.
collapsed
That
field?
that infinite potential. That's exactly it. That describes it very well. Because your body's a living organic system that's living literally on the infinite potential that is the universe. Like
Right.
when people say, "Oh yeah, it breaks the laws to be able to make free energy. There's no such thing as free energy." I say, well, yeah, that was, sold to you by universities and power companies. I mean, there is nothing but a free energy. We live in an
Right.
infinite sea of energy. That's all there is. Just somebody was smart enough to put a meter on it and charge you for
Well,
it.
that's the thing. It's like it's illegal, literally illegal, to use ham radios without a license. You can create probably wallpaper that has a freaking broadband receiver, and you can harvest energy
Yeah, yeah,
and then convert it
you
into
can.
electricity. But that's probably illegal. So,
Yeah,
actually, FCC wise, I think it is illegal. So it's
yeah,
interesting that you say that because it's all energy around us, and that's the hard part to get through to people that we want to focus on EMFs being bad or like people are starting to realize we're more than physiochemical beings, we're electromagnetic beings, and that energy modalities and electrotherapy is I think the future of general medicine. I think given enough time where everybody's going to find this to be a very far upstream mechanism of how we can support the body and bring balance and health and wellness and longevity to the body. um, yeah, this one aspect of that I want to cover as well, because you've covered scalar and we've kind of like talked about all these pieces and parts, but I've never really heard anybody talk about. I mean, you introduced me to Guy Oblinsky and your connection with him and the Teslatron. So I'm really curious about these what they call time reversed waves.
yeah.
Um, can you talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, so essentially, and you said it earlier too, that superluminal thing, that's what Guy's, goal was to achieve, and that's how his device really worked. Uh, you'd have to understand wave packets, I guess. and solitons, and solitons move in a uniform thing. It's kind of like when you're looking at lasers in the coherent light. When you have a channel for something to move through, and the easiest way to visualize a soliton is to picture a channel of water and then a ship moving through the water. And there's experimental videos you can see uh, on online and stuff like that that explains these principles. But as a waveform moves within a channel, it creates that compression and rarefaction that we were talking about. And when you can create those things, they have the potential, those packets of energy has the potential to move beyond the speed of light and to time reverse in this way. And so when Guy had his machine set up, they did experiments where they physically took physical stopwatches and put one closer to the electrode of the device and one at the end of the room, and measured immeasurable time differences between them. So that's in a case of physical time. So the idea of the time reverse that we talk about is more like a cellular memory and things like that, but it does go as far as being able to modulate physical time and space. And I suppose this is why a lot of these kind of technologies have been heavily suppressed over the years, or a lot of disinformation has come out about them,
Right.
is because they've always been cutting edge technologies for the military industrial complex, and they wanted to cover their tracks so nobody could understand these things. So it's part
Yeah.
of the process when you get into it on that level. But that idea of time reversal is not only on a cellular level but on a physical level like that, and it's used commonly. It's used in fiber optics, like when they create a long network, the signal degrades over the time of the impurities in the glass fiber.
Resistance.
Uh,
Yeah.
and there's ways of bouncing the signal off a partial mirror that bring it back, and then it goes into those little nodes that restructure the waveform and time reverse the waveform uh, back into a more coherent signal that matches the original signal that it came from.
So
So
it's
the
like,
idea that we can apply it metaphysically or biologically, I guess, to the cells in your body is that we're providing that waveform that bounces back, that has the feedback with your own DNA that remember its pattern that it was before it started to lose bits and pieces of it to break down.
yeah. And that's what the problem with aging is, that we're making copies of copies all the time. So if we can maintain that integrity at the cell level, it's just really information photonically being passed through water to other cells and being passed down. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's really interesting stuff on the time reverse waves,
Ties it
because
in to the phase conjugate mirror, because you need that phase conjugation to bring the information back. It's really your body just informing itself of what it forgot.
it's like a self
And
amplification.
yeah,
That's impressive, because that's exactly what you need. It's not dependent on frequency. It's not dependent on like a spectrum of light. That's I think the questions that come up for me, and I think a lot of other people, is just like, when you look at Theraphi, you see all these like light therapies, kind of like what we started the conversation on, like lasers. Could you like even could you use lasers in the same format? Like, why plasma? Like, what's
yeah,
going on? It just seems so mysterious. And you're talking about it being a noble gas or conscious. Um,
yeah,
why the spin on a very stable plasma gas versus any other kind of light or
right.
wavelength?
Well, yeah. I mean, what happens with lasers is it's highly concentrated light. That idea, that mirror reflection of folding the light into itself. And I mean, this is how it all came about. The original laser was like a ruby rod with a full mirror on one side and a partial mirror on the other. And when you put photons into it from a plasma tube, again, around the outside of it, the photons get captured in that ruby rod and bounce back and forth and bounce it back and forth until they can overcome the partial mirror. And then they come out in these little wave packets and form this coherent line. You can build a lot of energy like that. I started off years ago when we were doing the water experiments and stuff like that with little CO2 lasers, milliwatts and things like that. My biggest laser right now is a 3,000 watt fiber laser that has such intense power. You're talking of megawatts of power that's concentrated into the needle point size.
Jeez.
So that's
Got your
one of
own
the,
death ray, huh?
yeah, oh yeah, yeah, and it's capable of doing a lot of amazing things. Then and that's part of the things is that there's a lot of power in the lasers, and the difference. I've done a lot of light with basically LED type lasers and things like that, putting patterns on the body and uh, different devices like that over the years that use lasers.
Hmm.
But I found that highly concentrated thing. It could only be used in certain ways. Like the body can it's better at absorbing the more subtle energies that come from the Theraphi than highly concentrated, intense energies. If you want to work on acupuncture points and stuff like that, you're doing deep work on just like putting a needle in or moxibustion or
Yep.
whatever
Hmm.
you're doing. Light can have that advantage to it. But the idea, again, is going to, rather than the super stimulation, that more uh, gentle field. I like to say the Theraphi is like the biggest subtle energy device ever created. The most
Yeah, the
powerful,
most powerful. Yeah.
yeah, the most powerful energy, subtle energy device created. And that's why, is because that subtle energy is how we realize that everything in nature works. Everything has a subtle energy about it. Uh, until you go into larger scale things where you're looking at waves from oceans and stuff like that. So you know what happens when you go surfing and you wipe out on a wave in the ocean, you go into the washing machine effect.
Yep.
So the idea that the way I look at it is, yeah, why not stick to the more subtle things and then have less violence and less, more harmonically inclusive frequencies
Yep.
and fields that are involved rather than super intense fields.
That makes a lot of sense with the subtlety and the softness of and there's the pliability of plasma versus something like a laser, because that collimated light, it's more highly self-referential, meaning if I was to shine a laser on my shirt or on my skin, you wouldn't see any of the light or color on my shirt or my skin, because that would be occupying the space. It's just so coherent, it's so intense, it's so focused, and doesn't lose it doesn't spread out over distance.
Right.
Which is really kind of, I guess, a therapeutic value in certain applications, like you're saying. But with the plasma field, yeah, I can see why you'd want it to be a lot more pliable and softer. And when you lay in the light, I mean, it's just a really cool effect, especially when you have like it's at nighttime or it's in a dark room. Um, it has a feel and a look about it that I've never. It's really hard to capture. You know, I've taken a lot of photographs of it, and it's just really hard to capture the essence. It's just something you really have to experience in person to, I think,
Yeah.
really get the full effect as far as like how complex that light is. And of course, I'm not going to ask you about the noble gas blends because I'm sure that's proprietary, but it's very unique in a lot, because I played with a lot of photobiomodulation. I have like laser devices and LED type panels and whatnot. And I think light therapy is definitely um, really has a lot of benefits. But the Theraphi is just it's a light, but it's
Yeah.
just kind of way beyond that in a lot of respects from my personal experience and things I've seen with other people.
Yeah, Dinshaw. That was a guy when I got into understanding light. P. Gadali Dinshaw, I think his name was, and he did all kinds of experiments with very specific wavelengths of light. So we were taking and getting. There's a filter company that makes Roscoe Filters makes these lighting filters for stage performances and stuff like that, and they put metals in the glass and they make it so it is polar, so the polarized light, and then you can literally get the exact nanometer wavelengths of light. And this is what Dinshaw was doing, and he found all these different healing modalities to different wavelengths of light. And yeah, if you go back and study his books, and he became one of these rare obscure characters that nobody's really heard of before too, but all of light and color therapy kind of spun off of his work. And he found that he could use different wavelengths of light for heat treating different things. He'd use a yellow for burns on the skin, and he blue for upset stomachs and digestive things and stuff like that. So uh, there is something to narrowing down those wavelengths and concentrating them in that way. But I guess when you think about the way the Theraphi is working with that very soft, very it's feminine. It's a feminine energy that's to the plasma. Even the color mix is, sort of that rosy hue to it. So I'd say when you're comparing this type of light to laser light, the laser light's very masculine, and the Theraphi light is very feminine.
And it correlates completely. I mean, 100%. Like if you look at it from a traditional Chinese medicine perspective, it's creating a yin field, which yin is the nothing that holds the everything, and you can correlate that with scalar and that potentiality versus actuality. Yeah, it totally makes sense to me, and I think that's it's really kind of brilliant what you've put together with this particular machine, and I'm hoping more people can kind of, you know, have the opportunity to lay in one of these fields, because the scalar aspect, it takes away the need for specificity, and that's what I like it. And it's more holistic in the sense that, the same principles you find in nature. You go out in sunlight, you're getting, all these frequency wavelengths. You don't have to specify. And when you're laying in this field, because it's just this pure potentiality of this yin or this feminine field, the body kind of does what it needs to do, and it brings kind of a balancing effect to, you don't have to really know what's going on with you. And that's what's, I think, beautiful about it, is that you don't have to be like, oh, I need this color for this thing, or I need this color for that thing. You don't have to really kind of do the guesswork and have that, the analytical aspect of it. You can just like get into a relaxed, peaceful state, and the body does what it does, and you just kind of get the mind out of the way in a lot of respects, just because you become more relaxed. So I think that's all those Tai Chi principles, and what we teach in like Qigong, and it's all kind of the same thing. It's like getting out of the body's way, letting the mind rest, reset, let the body do what it does. If you cut yourself, you don't have to think about
Right.
healing a cut. It just does it. The information's there. You're just making a coherent electrostatic field, and that's collapsed pure potentiality that the body can utilize to reset and reach a higher level of coherence at the cellular level, which is essentially time reversal at the cell level, from what you're saying, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that's the masculine aspect of the Theraphi. There is that masculine aspect. That's the power that's going into the machine, that's getting transformed through the coil, this Tesla coil amps that power up through resonance and folding those wavelengths on top of each other until it reaches such strength. And that's what's happening inside a Tesla coil, is all these wavelengths and harmonics of the resonant frequency of that coil bouncing back and forth, much like the laser, until they break out, and then you have these arcs come out of it, right? So that's the masculine force that you're putting into the feminine side of the plasma to create that field. They're working together in that way too.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's the analogy I've always used for traditional Chinese medicine to get people to wrap their minds around it.
Yeah,
Yin and yang principles, that yeah, that it can flip. Extreme yang becomes yin, and back and forth. It's kind of like if you get a fever, you're getting the chills. You'll get real cold and real yin, and then you'll get really hot and like expansive, and you'll sweat. Or if you like cut off the circulation in your finger, eventually it'll turn blue and tingling, and it'll cycle between yin and yang until it finds that kind of balance. So
right.
yeah, that yang creating the yin field, which in turn the yin field fuels life and gives the potential for you to be, more alive than before, more healthy, or more coherent, or however you want to phrase that.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's that self-replicating cycle, which is really cool, that I've never seen done in a technology in particular, because normally
right.
nature does that.
Nature
Normally we
does.
do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that really hit me when I started doing the Wim Hof techniques and stuff like that. We'd go out and stand in the snow in our bare feet, and it'd be, below 0 degrees Celsius outside, and just, get out in your shorts and stand there for a bit until your feet got really cold. And all of a sudden the body kicks in, right? And it turns into this flight or flight syndrome, and all
Hmm.
these things start to activate within the body. And then when you step out of the snow, your feet are burning hot. They're not freezing cold. As soon as the blood hits them
Yep.
and rushes back into, so the body is continuously running that yin yang cycle like that, for sure.
100%. Yeah. And I've got a lot more cool stuff that we could go into. I know we want to save a lot of it for the academy. So we got this Theraphi Academy that we're starting. So anybody interested in that that's listening to this, go to the theraphiusa.com, and we'll have links there to the Theraphi Academy. We're just going to go into a lot of the more esoteric understandings and knowledge, and we've only scratched the surface with Paul. The intention of this talk and this conversation was just to kind of get people up to speed on what's going on with Theraphi, who Paul is, all this kind of stuff. But we really want to go down the rabbit hole, and for people that want to take their training or education to the next level, that's going to be a really fun membership to get involved with. So again, you can find that at theraphiusa.com. Did you have any kind of last anything else you wanted to cover or talk about while we're chatting?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess just while you were saying that, I'm thinking, I've been pretty quiet over the years. I kind of have my own laboratory and workspace. And as an inventor, I suppose it was part of the mindset of, all these amazing inventions, and inventors get this. They have this thing where, oh yeah, they can't tell anybody about it, or you don't want somebody to steal it or whatever. But
Mm-hmm.
I think as I get older now, I realize all these things that I've just kind of kept to myself over the years about how maybe more important it is now to start talking about them and get it out there, because I've seen a real keen interest, especially on the evolution of things like just watching YouTube and how many young people are getting into these type of things and making their own videos and doing their own experiments. And I think this is a really exciting time to be alive, probably one of the most exciting times in human history. But when I grew up, I was like, oh, I should have been born in the Renaissance era or whatever. And I had all these different time periods that I thought would have been better. But now I realize that this is one of the greatest times to be alive on this planet in all of human history, because we have such this infinite potential that we're seeing now. There's been a lot of, you know, obscurity over the years, a lot of occlusion to keep things secret and to keep things undercover in order for power and control and wealth and these kind of things. But we're reaching this point in time right now, like Pluto has just crossed over into Aquarius and touched the first little instance of this. This is the big wake up time now, where it's the apocalypse. Like the veil is lifted. Literally, that's the meaning of apocalypse.
Yep.
The veil's lifted.
Great
Everybody
change.
sees what's
Yep.
going on now. It's like, holy smokes, how do we rebuild this crazy train that we're on, right? And I think it's a really important time right now. And I'm really excited for all the people that are out there doing this kind of work, because it's very important. And this is what will steer us back together into a more cohesive, conscious species that's going to move forward in this planet rather than destroy ourselves, which is we're kind of in the duality crux right now, and this is
100%.
the way we're going to pull out of it.
Yeah, it's the education, it's the understanding, it's developing your own individual consciousness to kind of contribute to the whole. And I didn't want to say anything too, because I know you got a lot kind of like not only on the bench, but just as far as like how we can have actual sustainable energy, like for living, not just for health and wellness or these kind of modalities or applications. So I think I'm really excited, because I'm excited to do more interviews with you and kind of pick your brain, because you're just one of the multifaceted people that is kind of full spectrum. And I appreciate that. I think people, and it's not a jack of all trades kind of thing. I think you have to kind of have these data points or these nodes of understanding to be well-rounded. I used to train a lot of Tai Chi pretty hardcore for every day for years. And the lineage that I worked with, they would talk about back in like old times, to be well-rounded, you have to study like, art, philosophy, writing, language, calligraphy, martial arts, healing arts, to be a well-rounded person. And I think with this speciality that you were talking about, like people get in these specialities, they lose that full spectrum nature. And I think that's really exciting that you're willing to share. I mean, because it's a lifetime worth of information, and your lineage and connection back to Guy Oblinsky, who had a physical relationship with or that sounds bad, had a relationship with Nikola Tesla, like a friendship and a scientific relationship. Those lineages are kind of priceless, at least from what I've learned with herbal medicine and diet, nutrition and stuff, like having those connections and that linkage to the past and the consciousness evolution of how things got to where they are is exactly what you're saying. Is like that's how we get out of it, is being able to kind of like refine ourselves, help people grow and develop, consciously. And that's why, I think we created the Theraphi Academy. Is like, this is a place where you're going to learn stuff that you're really not going to find anywhere else. And I was really also excited to get in contact with you because I've seen a lot of this terminology before. I'm not like a newbie to scalar or phase conjugation or this kind of stuff. And you see a lot of products, a lot of people saying this kind of stuff, putting it on their website, having machines that really do nothing. I mean, they might look fancy, they might have a good fit and finish, but the Theraphi is kind of the reverse. It has like all substance, and then all you really, is refining the outsides. It's just it's on the inside that what's on the inside that counts. So it's a pretty impressive technology. And again, I really respect your time and energy and everything you're willing to share with people. It's really cool.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Brandon.
Yep. Well, take care. We'll talk to you next time.
Okay, talk soon.